The dust of the hiring ground settles on shame. It coats the tongue, grits between the teeth, and clings to the threadbare dress of the last girl left on the block. Her name is Alara, though no one has bothered to ask. To the hard-faced men and their scrutinizing wives, she is merely a collection of deficiencies. Too thin in the arms, too hollow in the cheeks, a shadow where a sturdy worker ought to be. The auctioneer, a man whose voice is oiled with false bonhomie, has already moved on, his attention on a pair of draft horses with more perceived value. Alara stands alone, a ship forgotten by the tide, the murmurs of the crowd lapping at her feet like a cold, indifferent sea. Across the square, Silas Blackwood shoves a sack of flour into the back of his wagon. He came to redemption for salt, seed, and solitude, the three staples of his life. He has no use for another soul on his remote ranch, least of all one who looks like a strong wind could carry her off. Yet his gaze keeps snagging on her, on the rigid set of her spine, a lone protest against the slump of her shoulders, on the way her hands are knotted together, white-knuckled and still. He sees not weakness, but a brittle sort of pride, the kind a man sees in a fence post that refuses to fall in a gale, even as it splinters. A brute of a man, Jedediah Thorne, laughs loudly and points a meaty finger at her. "Might be worth $1 for kindling," he bellows to his cronies, and their laughter is a volley of stones. Silas feels something hot, an unfamiliar coil in his gut. It's the same feeling he got when he saw a wolf corner a doe, the same instinct that made him raise his rifle without a second thought. He tells himself it's none of his business. He tells himself to turn away, to climb onto his wagon and drive his quiet life back up into the mountains. But his feet, worn and stubborn as the leather of his boots, stay planted in the dust. He watches as the auctioneer dismisses her with a wave. "Take her to the parish house," the man says, his voice devoid of all its earlier boom. "They'll find a place for her at the wash house, I suppose, the wash house. A place of steam and lie and women with backs bent into permanent arches, a place where hope was laundered out of his soul until nothing was left but pale, frayed resignation." Alara's head drops, a final, silent surrender. And that is the thing Silas cannot watch. That was a close call. Before we see how our hero navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. He doesn't think. The decision is made somewhere in the space between one heartbeat and the next, a spark jumping a gap in his carefully constructed isolation. He moves, his long legs eating up the distance across the square. The crowd parts before him, accustomed to the quiet rancher who came to town twice a year and spoke to almost no one. They stare as he stops directly before the auctioneer, his shadow falling over the girl. "How much?" Silas asks. His voice is rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. The auctioneer blinks, startled. "4. For her?" "Sir, she's not. There's no contract. The hiring's done. I'm not asking about a contract," Silas says, his voice low and flat. "I'm asking for a price. You were ready to sell her for kindling. I'll pay for the wood." The insult is plain, but it's aimed at Thorne, whose face is purpling with rage. Alara flinches, thinking the insult is for her, too. She shrinks smaller. The auctioneer, smelling $1 where there was none before, grins. "Well, a man's labor is his own to offer. Let's say $5 for a year's service." Silas's eyes, cold and clear as a mountain stream, don't leave the auctioneer's face. $1, the man sputters. "1? That's an insult." "It's $1 more than you had a minute ago," Silas counters. "Take it, or I'll take my business, all of it, to Cedar Flats next season." The threat hangs in the air, heavy and real. Silas Blackwood didn't spend much, but what he did spend was steady. The auctioneer's greed wars with his pride and loses. He sighs, snatching the silver dollar from Silas's outstretched hand. "Done," he spits. "She's your problem now." Silas doesn't so much as glance at the man. He turns his head slightly, his gaze finally falling on the girl. She's staring at the ground, her whole body trembling. And with 3 words, his life and hers were irrevocably changed. Come on, girl. The journey to his ranch was a study in silence. Silas had pointed to the wagon bed, a gesture that was neither kind nor unkind, merely functional. Alara had scrambled up without a word, settling herself between a sack of beans and a crate of tools, making herself as small as possible. She didn't look at him, didn't look at the town of redemption as it shrank behind them, didn't look at the rolling foothills that gradually sharpened into the hard, granite shoulders of the mountains. She looked only at her own hands, twisting a loose thread on her cuff, as if it were the single anchor in a world that had just tilted on its axis. Silas, for his part, kept his eyes on the rutted track and the rumps of his two sturdy mules, Bess and Abner. The silence was his native element, yet this silence was different. It was occupied. He could feel her presence, behind him like a change in the weather, a low-pressure system holding its breath. He was a man who lived by the rigid geometry of necessity. He needed firewood, so he chopped it. He needed water, so he hauled it. His fences needed mending, so he mended them. This was an act of pure, uncalculated impulse, and it sat uneasily in his gut. He hadn't needed a girl. He hadn't needed another mouth to feed, another shadow in his small cabin. He'd acted on an instinct he didn't recognize, a sudden, sharp rebellion against the casual cruelty of men like Thorne. Now, the consequence of that rebellion was a silent, shivering girl in the back of his wagon. He tried to justify it with logic. The garden needed more tending than he could give it if he was to keep the ranch running. The cabin could use a proper cleaning. There was mending and washing and 100 other small tasks that he performed with clumsy inefficiency. A worker. That's what she was. A $1 worker for a year. It was a transaction, but the logic felt thin, a flimsy blanket against the cold truth of the matter. He had seen her standing there, stripped of dignity, and had acted not as a man hiring help, but as a man intervening in a beating. The sun began its slow descent, painting the undersides of the clouds in bruised shades of purple and rose. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. He heard a faint shiver of movement from the back and glanced in the small, cracked mirror he'd nailed to the side of the wagon frame. She had pulled her knees to her chest, her arms wrapped around them, her face buried. He looked away quickly, a feeling akin to intrusion prickling his skin. He thought of the spare blanket folded in the box under his seat. It was an old horse blanket, rough and smelling of wool and dust. He drove on for another 10 minutes, the debate silent and fierce in his mind. It was just a blanket. It was a kindness she might misinterpret. It was a practical measure against the mountain cold. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like gravel shifting, he pulled the mules to a halt. Without turning around, he reached under the seat, pulled out the folded blanket, and tossed it over his shoulder into the wagon bed. It landed near her with a soft thud. He didn't say a word, just clucked to the mules and set them moving again. For a long while, there was no sound but the creak of the wheels and the jingle of the harness. Then, in the little mirror, he saw a pale, hesitant hand reach out and touch the rough wool. She drew it slowly towards her, unfolding it and wrapping it around her thin shoulders. She didn't look up. She didn't offer thanks. But Silas saw the slight easing of the tension in her small frame, the way she burrowed into the meager warmth it offered. It was enough. The silence that followed felt different again, a fraction less brittle, a degree less cold. They arrived well after dark. The ranch was little more than a clearing carved out of the vast, indifferent wilderness. A small, sturdy cabin of peeled logs, a barn that leaned with the prevailing wind but held its ground, and a web of corrals stood stark against the star-dusted sky. A single lamp burned in the cabin window, a tiny point of gold in an ocean of black. Silas had left it burning that morning, a ritual of hope that he would return to his own small pocket of the world. He brought the wagon to a stop and swung down, his joints stiff from the long ride. "We're here," he said, his voice once again a stranger in the quiet. Alara didn't move at first. She seemed to be peering into the profound darkness that surrounded the little homestead, a darkness alive with the chirr of crickets and the distant, lonely call of a hunting owl. This was an isolation far deeper than the crowded anonymity of town. This was the edge of the map. He saw her swallow, a small, visible motion in the gloom. Slowly, as if testing the stability of the world, she unwrapped the blanket, folded it with a neatness that seemed entirely out of place, and set it aside. She clambered over the side of the wagon, her feet landing on the packed earth with a soft thud. She stood waiting, her hands once again clasped before her, a posture of perpetual apology. "Barn's got a loft," Silas stated, not looking at her. "There's clean hay. It's dry." He wasn't a cruel man, but he was a practical one. He had one room and one bed. The barn was the logical place. He expected a nod, a quiet acceptance. He did not expect the tiny, almost inaudible sound she made. It was a hitch of breath, a caught sob that she immediately stifled. His head snapped around. In the faint light from the cabin window, he saw a single tear trace a path through the dust on her cheek. Her face was a mask of terror. He frowned, his mind working slowly. The barn. Of course. For a girl alone, a barn was no fortress. It was a place of shadows and things that crept. It was a place of vulnerability. He cursed himself silently for his thoughtlessness. He was so used to his own company, to a world where the only dangers were weather and predators, that he had forgotten the dangers posed by man. "No," he said, the word coming out sharper than he intended. She flinched. He softened his tone, a conscious effort that felt foreign on his tongue. "No, not the barn." He gestured towards the cabin with his head. "There's a storeroom. Small, but it's inside." He turned and walked towards the cabin door, not waiting to see if she followed. He trusted she would. She had no other place to go. Inside, the cabin was one large room, spare and ruthlessly clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept. A sturdy table with two chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made, occupied one corner, and a cooking stove and shelves of provisions occupied another. It was a monk's cell, a testament to a life stripped down to its barest essentials. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and soap. Silas lit another lamp, and the room filled with a warm, flickering light. He pointed to a narrow door at the back. In there, Alara moved past him, a ghost in a worn dress. The storeroom was hardly bigger than a closet, filled with sacks of grain, hanging braids of onions, and shelves of preserved vegetables in glass jars. But it was clean, it was dry, and the door had a small wooden bolt on the inside. Silas saw her eyes fix on that bolt, and a flicker of something, relief, maybe, passed across her face. "There's spare bedding in that chest," he said, pointing to a wooden trunk in the corner of the main room. "You can make a pallet." He felt a strange, clumsy urge to say more, to offer some word of comfort, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, he turned to the stove. "Are you hungry?" She started, as if the question was a shock. She looked from him to the shelves of food, her eyes wide. She gave a single, jerky nod. He didn't ask what she wanted. He cut thick slices of bread from a loaf, ladled stew from a pot kept warm on the back of the stove, and set a plate and a mug of water on the table. He did it all with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He placed the food on one side of the table, then took his own plate and sat on the other, his back partially to her. He was giving her space, a silent acknowledgement of her fear. He ate without looking at her, listening to the small sounds she made. The scrape of the chair as she sat, the clink of the spoon against the bowl. She ate quickly, desperately, but with a strange sort of daintiness, as if afraid of making too much noise, of taking up too much space. When she finished, she sat with her hands in her lap, her plate clean. The silence stretched. Finally, Silas cleared his throat. "The work starts at sunup," he said, his voice matter of fact. "We'll see what you're good for." It was the language he understood. Work, purpose, utility. He was trying to put their arrangement back on a footing he could comprehend. He was the rancher. She was the help. He risked a glance at her. She was looking at him now, her eyes dark and unreadable in the lamplight. "I'm not worth much, sir," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost to the sigh of the wind outside. The words were a plain statement of fact, an assessment she had been given and had come to believe. I'll do my best not to be a burden." Silas stared at her. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, the deep, ingrained belief in her own worthlessness. He thought of Thorne's jeering, of the auctioneer's dismissal. He thought of the dollar he'd paid, a sum that was both an insult and a rescue. The hot coil of anger in his gut tightened again, but this time it was mixed with something else, something that felt dangerously like pity, like a responsibility that went far beyond a simple year of labor. He had bought himself a problem, all right. But looking at her, he started to suspect the problem wasn't the girl herself, but the world that had tried to break her. He gave a curt nod, unable to find a single word of rebuttal. "Get some sleep," he grunted, and turned his attention to cleaning his plate, the scraping of his fork against the tin a loud, deliberate noise in the sudden, heavy quiet of the room. The first week was a silent negotiation of boundaries. Alara rose before him, a wraith in the pre-dawn gray. By the time Silas stirred, the fire was already coaxed back to life in the stove, its warmth a welcome surprise in the chill mountain air. She moved through his space with the quiet efficiency of a mouse, never touching his personal items, his razor, his book, the tintype of a stern-faced woman on the mantel, but cleaning around them with meticulous care. She learned the rhythm of the ranch through observation. She saw him haul buckets from the well, and the next morning, she was there, struggling with the weight of a half-full pail, her thin arms trembling with the effort. He took it from her without a word, and from then on, made it his first chore to fill the water barrels for the day. She was, as she had warned, not strong. The first time she tried to muck out the mule's stall, she was clumsy with a heavy pitchfork, her movements lacking the leverage of a person used to such labor. Silas watched her from the corral fence for a few minutes, his brow furrowed. He saw the frustration on her face, the way she bit her lip and attacked the task with a renewed but ineffective fury. He walked over, took the pitchfork from her unresisting hands, and said, "Watch." He showed her how to use her body weight, how to plant her feet, how to make the tool an extension of her own momentum. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, his instructions purely technical. "Brace here. Lift with your legs, not your back." Like this, he didn't offer praise or criticism, just information. She watched intently, her gaze fixed on his movements. When he handed the fork back to her, she tried again. It was still a struggle, but it was no longer a losing battle. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not pride, but the absence of despair. He grunted, a sound that was his closest equivalent to approval, and walked away, leaving her to it. Her worth, he began to discover, was not in her strength but in her attention. She had an eye for things he had long since stopped seeing. She found a patch of wild mint growing by the creek and began serving it brewed in hot water in the evenings. The simple, clean scent of it cleared his head after a long day. She noticed the way the back door of the cabin stuck in its frame and spent an entire afternoon patiently sanding down the edge with a piece of broken stone until it swung smooth and silent. It was a task he had meant to do for 2 years. One day, he came in from the north pasture to find she had taken down his collection of torn shirts and work pants. She sat by the fire, a needle and thread in hand, her head bent in concentration, her stitches small and impossibly neat. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a full minute, an unfamiliar feeling tightening his chest. His mother had mended his clothes like that. The memory was so distant it was like a dream, but the feeling it evoked was sharp and real. He made a noise in his throat to announce his presence, and she looked up, her eyes wide with alarm, as if she expected to be scolded for taking a liberty. The thread was in the biscuit tin," she stammered, holding up the shirt as evidence. "I hope it was all right." "It's fine," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. He walked past her to wash his hands, his back to her. "It's good." The last 2 words were spoken so quietly he wasn't sure she heard them. But when he sat down to dinner, he noticed she didn't flinch every time he moved, and the silence between them felt a little less like a void and a little more like shared space. Their first trip back to Redemption was a necessity. He was running low on salt and coffee, and he needed a new blade for his scythe. He announced it at breakfast. "We're going to town." The words hung in the air. He saw the color drain from her face. Her hands, which had been stirring oatmeal in a pot, went still. Redemption was the site of her humiliation. It was a place of staring eyes and cruel laughter. "I don't have to go," she said quickly, her eyes on the pot. "I can stay here. There's work to be done." "The wagon needs watching," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was a lie, or at least a half-truth. He never left his wagon unattended for long. The real reason was something he wouldn't admit, even to himself. He would not leave her alone and unprotected at the ranch for a full day. The wilderness held dangers, but the world of men held worse. "You'll come." The ride down the mountain was as silent as the first ride up, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the tense silence of two people approaching a shared ordeal. When the first buildings of the town came into view, he saw her hands twist together in her lap, the same gesture of white-knuckled anxiety he'd seen in the auction block. He pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the mercantile, the same spot as before. "Stay with the wagon," he ordered, his voice flat. "Don't talk to anyone." He swung down and strode into the store without a backward glance. But he was acutely aware of her, a small, still figure perched on the wagon seat. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of leather, tobacco, and dried goods. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, greeted him with his usual professional courtesy. "Silas, good to see you. What can I get for you today?" As Abernathy measured out coffee beans, the door creaked open and two women from the town entered, their arms linked. They stopped short when they saw Silas, their conversation dying in their throats. They exchanged a look, a quick, meaningful glance that was as loud as a shout. Silas ignored them, his jaw tight. He paid for his goods, his movements clipped and precise. As he turned to leave, one of the women, Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, spoke, her voice dripping with saccharine concern. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "we were all so surprised to hear you taking on help. Especially that particular girl." Silas stopped, his hand on the door latch. He didn't turn around. "Were you?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. A man in your position, living alone. It does cause talk." The implication was as clear as it was ugly. Silas could feel the heat rising up his neck. He could feel Abernathy's sudden, intense interest in arranging a display of canned peaches. He could feel the weight of their judgment, smug and suffocating. He thought of Alara, sitting on the wagon, exposed and alone. He turned slowly, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I find the quality of my help is my own concern. And I find the quality of town gossip to be uniformly poor." He stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence press in. She flushed, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. He gave a sharp, dismissive nod and walked out, letting the door swing shut behind him. He expected to find Alara huddled and miserable. Instead, she was sitting bolt upright, her gaze fixed on something across the street. Silas followed her line of sight. Jedediah, Thorne, and two of his hired hands were lounging in front of the saloon, watching her. Thorne had a smirk on his face, the same one he'd worn at the hiring ground. He saw Silas, and his smirk widened. He said something to his men, and they all laughed. Thorne took a swig from a flask and then deliberately spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, dangerously close to the wagon. It was a calculated insult, an act of territorial pissing. Alara flinched back as if she'd been struck. Silas felt that hot coil of rage ignite in his belly, brighter and faster than ever before. He threw the sacks into the wagon bed with more force than necessary, making the whole frame shudder. Alara jumped. "Get in the back," he snapped. She scrambled over the seat without a word. Silas climbed up, took the reins, and with a sharp crack over the mules' heads that was entirely for Thorne's benefit, pulled the wagon away from the curb and pointed it towards the mountain road. He didn't look back, but he could feel Thorne's eyes on him, a promise of future trouble. They rode out of town in a cloud of angry dust and renewed silence. But this silence was different, too. It was the silence of a shared enemy, a battle line drawn not between them, but around them. He had defended her, first with his words to Mrs. Gable, then with his silent, furious departure from Thorn. He had claimed her as part of his territory, his concern. And as they climbed back into the clean, cold air of the high country, he realized with a jolt that he wasn't just protecting a $1 worker. He was protecting his peace. And somehow, she had become a part of it. Life settled back into its quiet rhythm, but the trip to town had left its mark. A subtle shift had occurred, a strengthening of the invisible walls they had built around their two-person world. Alara, having witnessed his quiet defense of her, seemed to walk a little taller. The perpetual apology in her posture eased, replaced by a watchful stillness. She began to anticipate his needs, having a hot mug of coffee ready when he came in from the cold, laying out his mending basket in the evenings without being asked. She still spoke little, but her silence now seemed less about fear and more about a shared understanding that words were often unnecessary between them. Silas found himself observing her more closely, not as a rancher assessing a hand, but as a man watching a flower slowly, tentatively unfurl. He noticed the way the morning light caught the faint red highlights in her brown hair, the small, secret smile that touched her lips when she was tending her mint patch, the intense focus in her eyes as she learned to churn butter. These small details began to fill the empty spaces of his life, adding color and texture to his monochrome existence. He found himself looking for her when he rode in, his eyes scanning the clearing for a glimpse of her calico dress. The sight of her, small and determined, hanging laundry on a line strung between two pines, brought a strange, unfamiliar warmth to his chest. He dismissed it as the simple comfort of not being entirely alone, but the feeling persisted, stubborn and deeply rooted. He, in turn, began to make small, unspoken offerings. He started leaving a piece of dried apple or a spoonful of honey by her plate at breakfast. He built her a small, raised bed for her kitchen garden near the cabin door, so she wouldn't have to bend so low. He even, in a fit of uncharacteristic whimsy, spent an evening carving a small, clumsy-looking bird out of a piece of scrap pine. He left it on the sill of the storeroom window, and the next day, he saw it sitting on the shelf next to her pallet, a tiny, silent sentinel. The first snow of the season came early, a light dusting that melted by noon. But it was a warning. The mountain was preparing to shrug on its winter coat, and with it would come a deeper isolation, a more profound quiet. The work intensified. There was wood to be chopped and stacked, meat to be smoked, every crack in the cabin and barn to be chinked with mud and moss. They worked side by side from sunup to sundown, a silent, efficient team. He taught her how to read the clouds, how to tell by the ache in his own joints that a storm was coming. She, in turn, showed him how to properly stack the firewood so it would dry evenly and burn slow, a trick she'd learned in a previous, harder life she never spoke of. One afternoon, while they were reinforcing the roof of the barn, a loose shingle gave way under his boot. He slipped, his leg plunging through the rotten wood up to his thigh. He let out a sharp curse, a mixture of pain and frustration. Alara, who was on the ladder handing him nails, cried out, her face paling with alarm. "I'm all right," he grunted, trying to pull his leg free. But it was stuck fast, the jagged edges of the broken shingles digging into his calf. "Get the saw." She didn't panic. Her fear was visible in her wide eyes, but her hands were steady as she scrambled down the ladder and ran to the workshop. She returned moments later with a handsaw, her breath coming in short pants. "Tell me where to cut," she said, her voice tight but controlled. He directed her, his own voice strained as he tried to keep his weight off the trapped leg. She sawed carefully, her small hands surprisingly strong, her brow furrowed in concentration. The wood groaned and splintered. Finally, with a sharp crack, the section gave way, and he was able to pull his leg free. He slid down the roof and sat heavily on the ground, leaning against the barn wall. Alara was at his side instantly, her eyes on his leg. He'd been wearing thick denim pants, but they were torn, and blood was already soaking through the fabric. "It's just a scratch," he said, more to himself than to her. "Go fetch the whiskey and some clean rags from the cabin." She ran, her feet flying over the ground. When she returned, he had managed to roll up his pant leg. It wasn't just a scratch. A long, deep gash ran down his calf, bleeding sluggishly. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was ugly and would need stitches. Alara knelt in the dirt beside him, her face grim. She uncorked the whiskey bottle. "This will hurt," she said, her voice soft but firm. He braced himself with a nod. The whiskey felt like fire, and he hissed through his teeth, his knuckles white where he gripped his knee. When the initial agony subsided, he looked at her. She had the mending kit from the cabin, the one she used for his shirts. She was threading a needle, her movements deft and sure. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice rough. "It needs closing," she stated simply, not looking up from her task. "I've done it before. On a hog, mostly. But the principle is the same." For the first time since he'd met her, he saw a glimmer of dark, situational humor in her eyes. Despite the pain, a short, rough laugh escaped him. "A hog, huh? I'm honored." He leaned his head back against the barn wall and closed his eyes. "Do it." He felt the prick of a needle, a small, sharp bite. He felt her small, cool hands on his skin, incredibly gentle as she drew the edges of the wound together, her stitches as neat and precise as the ones on his shirts. She worked in silence, her full attention on the task. He was acutely aware of her closeness, of the scent of soap and mint that clung to her, a clean, fresh smell that cut through the barnyard odors of hay and manure. When she was done, she bandaged the wound tightly with clean strips of rag. "There," she said, sitting back on her heels. "You'll need to stay off it for a few days." "A few days," he scoffed. "The work won't wait." "Then I'll do it," she said, her chin lifting with a stubbornness that mirrored his own. "You taught me how. I'm not strong, but I'm not useless." He looked at her then, really looked at her. The timid, frightened girl from the hiring ground was gone. In her place was a young woman, still thin, still quiet, but with a core of tempered steel he was only just beginning to appreciate. She had faced his injury not with hysterics, but with calm competence. She had stitched his flesh back together with the same care she took mending his clothes. "All right," he said, the words tasting like a concession. "All right, Alara." It was the first time he had used her name. She started, her eyes widening. A faint blush rose on her cheeks. She looked down at her hands, but not before he saw the brief, brilliant spark of pleasure in her face. It was a small thing, the speaking of a name, but in the quiet, isolated world they had built, it felt momentous. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition. It was a single stitch, closing a gap between them. The mountain kept its promise. The day after Silas's fall, the sky turned a flat, bruised gray, and the wind began to howl, a mournful, hungry sound that rattled the windows of the cabin. By nightfall, the snow began. It wasn't a gentle dusting this time, but a thick, determined onslaught of white flakes that swirled and danced in the lamplight, piling up against the door and windows with relentless speed. The blizzard had arrived. Forced into inactivity, Silas sat by the fire, his bandaged leg propped up on a stool, a scowl etched on his face. He was not a man who took well to being idle. He watched Alara as she moved about the cabin, her presence a constant, quiet hum of activity. She fed the stove, checked the stores, kneaded a batch of dough for bread. She did it all with a calm purposefulness that stood in stark contrast to his own restless agitation. The storm that raged outside seemed to only amplify the profound quiet inside the cabin. It was an intimacy he was unaccustomed to, a shared confinement that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. On the second day of the storm, the fever set in. It started with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. His teeth began to chatter, and a dull ache settled deep in his bones. By evening, his skin was hot to the touch, and the gash on his leg, which had been healing cleanly, was now an angry red, the skin around the stitches swollen and puffy. The wound was infected. Alara saw it at once. She touched the back of her hand to his forehead, her expression growing grave. "You're burning up," she said, her voice low. He tried to brush it off. "It's nothing. A touch of ague." But even as he said it, a wave of dizziness washed over him, and the room seemed to tilt. "It's the leg," she said, her gaze fixed on the angry wound. "We need to get the poison out." He was too weak and fogged with fever to argue. He watched as she moved with a new authority. She stoked the fire until it roared, setting a pot of water to boil. She rummaged through his supplies, pulling out a small tin of drawing salve. She tore fresh rags and laid them out neatly on the hearth. Her fear was a palpable thing, a taut line in her shoulders, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective determination. She was no longer the timid girl. She was a general preparing for battle. She gently unwrapped the bandage, her touch surprisingly sure. The sight of the wound made her gasp. It was worse than she'd thought, weeping a thin, foul-smelling fluid. "Silas," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "this is bad." He grunted, his eyes half closed. The world was beginning to feel blurry and distant. He felt her press a hot, wet cloth to the wound, and he gritted his teeth against the searing pain. She cleaned it methodically, her face a mask of concentration. Then she applied the thick, dark salve, covering it with a fresh bandage. "You need to drink," she commanded, holding a mug of her mint tea to his lips. He drank, the hot liquid soothing his raw throat. The night was a long, fevered dream. He drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of the storm's relentless assault on the cabin and of Alara's constant presence. He would wake to find her bathing his face with a cool cloth or forcing him to drink more tea, her small hands steadying the mug. He heard her whispering, though he couldn't make out the words. Sometimes it sounded like a prayer, other times like a litany of instructions to herself. Keep the fire hot. Keep him warm. The fever must break sometime in the deep, dark hours of the morning. In a moment of lucid clarity, he opened his eyes and saw her sitting in the chair across from him, her head slumped forward in exhaustion, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had refused to use her pallet in the storeroom, staying by the fire to watch over him. In that moment, watching her sleep, a fierce wave of protectiveness washed over him, so powerful it almost took his breath away. It was no longer about responsibility or pity. He cared for this girl. The thought was terrifying and undeniable. His fever broke on the third day. He woke to the taste of clear broth on his tongue and the feeling of a clean, dry shirt on his skin. The world was sharp and solid again. The throbbing in his leg had subsided to a dull ache. Alara was sitting by his side, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes. When she saw he was awake and his eyes were clear, a look of profound relief washed over her face, so potent it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "The fever's gone," she whispered, touching his forehead again. Her hand was cool and gentle. "You," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed," she said, as if the alternative was unthinkable. "You were sick." He looked around the cabin. The fire was burning steadily. A pot of soup simmered on the stove. Everything was in its place. She had not only nursed him, she had kept their world running. She had been his anchor in the storm, both inside and out. They spent the next 2 days trapped by the snow, which had piled in deep drifts against the cabin. The enforced stillness created a new kind of space between them. The roles were reversed. He was the invalid, and she was the caregiver. She brought him his meals, changed the dressing on his leg with practiced skill, and read to him from his one book, a worn copy of Shakespeare, her voice soft and hesitant at first, then growing in confidence as she lost herself in the stories. He listened, not just to the words, but to the music of her voice, a sound he realized he had been starving for without even knowing it. In the quiet of the evenings, they began to talk. It started with him asking about the hog. Where had she learned to stitch a wound? The question opened a door she had kept bolted shut. Hesitantly, she began to speak of her life before redemption. She was an orphan, raised by a parish that had indentured her to a farmer and his wife when she was 12. They were hard people, she said, her voice flat and devoid of self-pity. They had worked her from before sunup to after sundown. The farmer's wife was cruel, with a sharp tongue and a heavy hand. The farmer was indifferent. It was there she had learned to mend and cook and clean, to tend a garden and put up preserves. It was there she had stitched up a gored piglet that the farmer had given up for dead, nursing it back to health in secret. He was a good pig, she said with a small, sad smile. They ate him for Christmas. She told him how she had gotten sick one winter, a lung fever that left her weak and coughing for months. She couldn't work as hard, and the farmer's wife declared her a useless drain on their resources. Her indenture was terminated. They hadn't even given her a full meal for the road, just a stale loaf of bread and the clothes on her back. They had pointed her in the direction of redemption, telling her there might be work for those willing. They said I wasn't worth the food I ate, she finished, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the fire. I suppose they were right. No, Silas said, his voice fierce and low. They were wrong. She looked up, startled by the intensity in his tone. He was leaning forward, his eyes boring into hers. A person's worth isn't something you can measure in bushels of wheat or hours of labor. They were cruel, ignorant people, Ilera. What they said was a lie. She stared at him, her lips parted. He had never spoken to her with such raw emotion. He had never looked at her with such conviction. She saw in his eyes not pity, but a furious, righteous anger on her behalf. It was a defense more powerful than the one in town, more intimate than the care she'd given him. He was defending not just her actions, but her very being. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped her eye and rolled down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or self-pity. It was a tear of release, the first crack in a dam of shame she had carried for years. She quickly wiped it away, but Silas had seen it. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a moment before he gently, hesitantly, laid it over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. His hand was large and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The simple, solid weight of his hand on hers was an anchor, a promise, a declaration. In the heart of the blizzard, surrounded by a world of white, something new and fragile and intensely warm had taken root in the little cabin. When the snow finally stopped and a pale sun emerged, the world outside was transformed. It was a pristine landscape of white and blue, beautiful and treacherous. It took them another full day to dig their way out of the cabin. The work was hard, but they did it together, a shared rhythm to their shoveling, a new ease in their proximity. The silence between them was now a comfortable blanket, woven through with the threads of their shared ordeal and her quiet confession. With his legs slowly healing, the balance of labor shifted back towards him, but it was no longer the same. They were partnership now. He would chop wood, and she would be there to stack it. She would tend the animals, and he would ensure the path to the barn was always clear of snow for her. He found himself talking more, pointing out the tracks of a snowshoe hare, explaining the workings of a trap line. She, in turn, would share small observations, the way a chickadee fluffed its feathers against the cold, the unique pattern of frost on a window pane. Their world, once defined by necessity and silence, was now being colored in with shared moments and quiet conversation. His feelings for her, the ones he had so fiercely denied, were now a constant presence, a low, steady flame in his chest. He found himself manufacturing reasons to be near her, to hear her voice. He would ask her opinion on things, where to set the new trap line, whether the flour was getting low, not because he needed the information, but because he wanted to hear her thoughtful, quiet answers. He loved the way she would pause, her head tilted, before speaking, as if giving every question its proper weight. He was falling in love with her. The realization didn't come in a flash. It seeped into him slowly, like warmth from a fire, until it was an undeniable part of his being. And it terrified him. He was a solitary man, a man who had built his life on the foundation of being alone. This feeling, this woman, threatened to demolish that foundation. What could he, a gruff, aging rancher with nothing to his name but a patch of hard land, possibly offer a girl like her? The answer to that question was forced upon him sooner than he expected. As the snow began to melt and the mountain paths became passable again, their isolation was broken. The first sign of trouble was a set of hoof prints near their southern fence line, prints that didn't belong to his mules. Silas studied them, his face grim. The horse had been shod in a particular way, a nick on the left foreshoe. He'd seen that shoe before, on Jedediah, Thorne's big roan. Thorne had been scouting his land. A few days later, the trouble became more direct. Silas was checking his fences when he found a section deliberately cut, the wires snipped clean. A half-dozen of his small herd of cattle had wandered out. It took him the better part of a day to track them down and herd them back, his leg aching with the effort. He knew, with a cold certainty, who was responsible. Thorne was testing him, prodding at his boundaries, reminding him of his presence. That night, as he sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, Ilera watched him, her face anxious. "It was Mr. Thorne, wasn't it?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said, not looking up from his work. "What does he want?" she whispered. Silas stopped his work and looked at her. Her face was pale in the firelight. He saw the fear in her eyes, a fear that was not for herself, but for him, for the fragile peace of their home. "He wants to prove he's a bigger man than me," Silas said, his voice flat. "He wants what he thinks is his—" The unspoken words hung in the air between them. "He wants you." The final escalation came a week later. It was dusk, a time of long shadows and deep quiet. Silas was in the barn, pitching hay for the mules. Ilera was inside the cabin, preparing their evening meal. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Acrid smoke, sharp and unnatural on the evening breeze. Then he heard it, a frantic cackle, the sound of fire catching on dry grass. He dropped the pitchfork and ran out of the barn. His heart seized. A line of fire was racing up the hill through the dry winter grass towards the north pasture, where his cattle were grazing, and worse, towards the dense pine forest that bordered his land. A forest fire would not only destroy him, it would threaten the whole mountain. He saw them then, two figures on horseback on the far ridge, silhouetted against the rising flames. Thorne and one of his men. They watched for a moment, then wheeled their horses and galloped away. Rage, cold and absolute, flooded through Silas. But there was no time for anger. He grabbed buckets, an old burlap sack, anything he could find. As he ran toward the fire, he saw the cabin door fly open. Ilera was there, her face a white mask of terror. "Stay in the cabin," he roared at her. "Get away from the smoke." But she didn't listen. She disappeared back inside for a second and reemerged, dragging one of the heavy horse blankets from his bed. She ran not away from the fire, but towards the creek, soaking the heavy wool blanket in the icy water until it was dripping and weighed a ton. He watched, stunned, as she began dragging the impossibly heavy, wet blanket towards the fire line. Her plan was clear. She was going to try to beat the flames out. It was a desperate, dangerous, and incredibly brave idea. "Ilera, no," he shouted, but she was already at the edge of the flames, the smoke billowing around her, her small figure dwarfed by the roaring fire. She swung the heavy blanket, bringing it down on the burning grass with a wet, hissing slap. Her courage spurred him into action. He couldn't let her fight it alone. He filled his own buckets and ran to join her, throwing water on the hottest spots while she beat at the edges of the blaze. It was hellish work. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking. Sparks flew, singeing their clothes and hair. Ilera coughed and gagged, her eyes streaming, but she did not stop. She swung the blanket again and again, her movements fueled by a desperate, ferocious energy. She was fighting for the ranch, for their home. He saw it in the set of her jaw, in the fire in her own eyes that rivaled the one they were battling. Together, inch by painful inch, they began to gain ground. They worked as a team, a silent, desperate ballet of water and wool. He would douse a section, and she would follow, smothering the remaining embers. The fire, which had seemed an unstoppable monster, began to shrink, to retreat under their combined assault. After what felt like an eternity, it was over. The last tongue of flame hissed and died. They stood in the center of a blackened, smoking patch of ground, their faces smeared with soot, their lungs aching. The air was thick with the stench of burnt grass. Ilera finally dropped the heavy blanket, her arms giving out. She swayed on her feet, exhausted. Silas rushed to her side, grabbing her arm to steady her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice raw. She nodded, leaning against him, her body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, his hands stroking her soot-stained hair. "You foolish, brave girl," he murmured into her hair. "You foolish, wonderful girl." She looked up at him, her face smudged and tear-streaked, but her eyes were shining with a fierce light. "He tried to take it," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "He tried to take our home, our home." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He looked past her at the small, sturdy cabin, its windows glowing with warm, welcoming light. He looked at the barn, the corrals, the blackened but saved pasture. It wasn't just his ranch anymore. It was theirs. He had been fighting for his property. She had been fighting for her home. In that moment, holding her in his arms, the last of his fear and hesitation burned away, consumed by the fire they had just extinguished. He knew what he had to do. He had to protect her, not just from Thorn, but from the world. He had to give her a claim, a foundation, a name that no one could ever take away. The following morning, Silas rose before dawn. He moved quietly, saddling his best mule, Abner, not the wagon team. He left a note on the table, a rare and difficult act for him. "Gone to town. Be back by nightfall. Bolt the door." He rode hard, his mind a maelstrom of resolve and anxiety. He was no longer just reacting to Thorn. He was seizing the initiative. His plan was audacious, desperate, and the only thing he could think of that offered a permanent solution. He bypassed redemption, heading instead for the small, dusty settlement of Cedar Flats, 10 miles further down the valley. It was a place where he was less known, a place that held fewer ghosts. He went straight to the circuit preacher, a thin, tired-looking man named Reverend Miller, whose house smelled of old paper and boiled cabbage. Silas stood before him, hat in hand, feeling as awkward and out of place as he had ever felt in his life. He explained the situation in the sparest possible terms. A woman in his employ, a man causing trouble, the need for protection, for a legal and binding tie. Reverend Miller listened patiently, his watery blue eyes studying Silas's face. "You wish to marry this woman," the preacher stated when Silas had finished his clipped, uncomfortable explanation. "I do," Silas said, the words feeling huge and strange in his mouth. "Is she agreeable to this arrangement?" the preacher asked gently. Silas hesitated. He hadn't asked her. The thought of proposing, of trying to explain the turbulent, protective, and tender emotions that were driving him, was more terrifying than facing down a wildfire. "It's for her safety," Silas said, his voice low. "It's to give her a name. My name. To make her untouchable by men like Thorn." The preacher nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He had seen the hardness of the world, the vulnerability of those caught in its gears. He saw the fierce sincerity in the rugged rancher's face. "The law requires her presence, her consent," he said. "But the bands can be prepared. A license can be drawn up. When you are both ready, I will come. Or you can bring her here." Silas left the preacher's house with a folded piece of paper tucked inside his shirt. It wasn't a marriage certificate, not yet, but it was a declaration of intent, a weapon he hoped he would not have to use, but one he would wield without hesitation if necessary. On his way out of Cedar Flats, he stopped at the general store and bought 2 things he had never purchased in his life: a small bag of lemon drop candies and a length of blue ribbon, the color of summer sky. He had no idea why he bought them, only that he had seen Alara looking at a similar ribbon on a woman's hat in Redemption, and the lemon drops, well, they just seemed like something that might bring a small, sweet moment of pleasure to a life that had known too little of it. He rode back to the ranch under a sky full of stars, the paper against his chest a strange mix of burden and shield. He found the cabin dark except for the faint glow of the banked fire. The door was bolted, as he had instructed. He knocked softly. "Alara? It's me." He heard a faint scraping sound as the bolt was drawn back. The door opened a crack. She peered out, her face pale and anxious in the moonlight. When she saw it was him, she opened the door wider, relief flooding her features. "You're back," she breathed. "I'm back," he confirmed. He stepped inside, the familiar warmth and scent of the cabin wrapping around him like a blanket. He saw that she had laid out a plate of food for him, covered with a cloth. She had waited up. Did you see him?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "No," Silas said. "And he won't be coming back tonight." He placed the bag of lemon drops and the blue ribbon on the table. Alara stared at them, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What's this?" "For you," he said gruffly, turning away to hang up his coat, unable to watch her reaction. He heard a small gasp. When he turned back, she was holding the ribbon, the strip of bright blue, a vivid slash of color in her pale hands. She looked from the ribbon to him, her eyes wide with a question she didn't dare ask. It's beautiful," she whispered. She didn't touch the candy. The ribbon was the thing. It was so unnecessary, so impractical. It was a gift. The first gift he suspected she had ever received. He saw the shine of unshed tears in her eyes and cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable. "The fire. It could have been worse," he said, changing the subject. "You were brave." "We were brave," she corrected him softly. She carefully folded the ribbon and placed it on the mantelpiece, giving it a place of honor next to the tintype of his mother. The gesture was so full of quiet reverence that it made his heart ache. He knew, then, that the paper in his pocket was not just a legal strategy. It was a promise he desperately wanted to keep, not just to protect her, but to bind her to him, to make their partnership, their home, a reality in the eyes of God and the world. But he still didn't know how to ask. The showdown came 2 days later. It was a bright, cold afternoon. Silas was splitting logs in the yard, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound in the crisp air. Alara was humming softly to herself as she hung a fresh batch of laundry, the blue ribbon tied in her hair, a flash of defiant color against the stark landscape. A fragile peace had settled over them, the peace of a battle won and a threat deferred. But they both knew it was temporary. They heard the horses first, the sound of multiple riders coming up the track at a steady, deliberate pace. Not the frantic gallop of a raid, but the confident tread of men who believed they had the law on their side. Silas lowered his axe, his body going still and watchful. Alara stopped her work, her hands freezing on a wet sheet. 4 riders emerged from the trees. Jedediah Thorne was in the lead, a smug, triumphant look on his face. Beside him rode the sheriff of redemption, a portly man named Biddle whose loyalty was known to be as flexible as the highest bidder's purse. 2 of Thorne's brutish hired hands brought up the rear. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, stirring up the dust. Sheriff Biddle cleared his throat, avoiding Silas's cold stare. "Silas," he said, his voice hearty and false. "We've come on a matter of official business." "This is my land, Biddle," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "State your business and be gone," Thorne smirked. "It's not your land we're interested in, Blackwood. It's your property." He gestured with his chin towards Alara, who had instinctively moved closer to the cabin, her face ashen. "I've come to collect what's mine." Silas didn't even look at him. His eyes were on Alara, on the terror that had returned to her face, erasing all the fragile confidence she had gained. "She's not property," Silas said, his voice dangerously level. "Oh, but she is," Thorne countered, enjoying himself. He pulled a folded, grimy document from his coat pocket. "I did some traveling. Went back to the farm she ran from. Turns out her indenture was never legally terminated, just abandoned. For the price of their back taxes, the farmer was happy to sign her contract over to me. It's all legal and proper. Sheriff Biddle has verified it." Biddle shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "The paper seems to be in order, Silas. The contract is binding. She belongs to Mr. Thorne." The words hung in the air, cold and final. "She belongs to Mr. Thorne." Alara made a small, wounded sound. She looked at Silas, her eyes wide with despair, her entire body trembling. She saw the legal paper, the sheriff's badge, the triumphant look on Thorne's face. She saw the walls of her hard-won sanctuary crumbling into dust. All the old fears, the old feelings of worthlessness, came rushing back in a suffocating wave. She took a half-step back, towards the cabin door, as if she could hide from the inevitable. "I'm not worth much, sir," she whispered, the words a surrender, a plea for him not to fight a battle he couldn't win. "I'm not worth the trouble. Maybe it's better if I just go." Her words cut Silas deeper than any blade. To see her broken again, to hear her offer herself up for sacrifice to save him from a fight, it was more than he could bear. All the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled to dust. In that moment, he didn't see a legal problem or a territorial dispute. He saw the woman who had nursed him through a fever, who had fought a fire for their home, who wore a cheap blue ribbon in her hair like it was a crown. He saw the woman he loved. He turned his back on Thorne and the sheriff, taking 2 steps until he was standing directly in front of her. He reached out and gently took her trembling hands in his. He looked down into her terrified, tear-filled eyes. The world narrowed to the space between them. The horses, the men, the threats, they all faded into a distant murmur. "Listen to me," he said, his voice no longer rough or gruff, but filled with a fierce, resonant tenderness she had never heard before. "You are not much. You are not a burden. You are not trouble." He squeezed her hands, willing her to believe him. "You are brave, and you are kind. You are the warmth in this cabin and the light in my day." He took a breath, the words he had been too afraid to think, let alone speak, finally breaking free. "Alara," he swore, his voice thick with emotion, "you're everything to me." She stared at him, her lips parted, her tears frozen on her cheeks. The world seemed to stop spinning. "You're everything to me." The words were a shield, a balm, a declaration so profound it rewrote her entire history of worthlessness. Thorne let out an impatient, ugly laugh. "Touching, Blackwood. But sentiment doesn't change the law. The contract is mine. The girl is mine." Silas didn't release her hands. He turned his head, his gaze, now blazing with a cold, righteous fire, pinning Thorne in his saddle. "She is not a contract, and she is not yours." He released one of her hands and reached inside his own shirt, pulling out the folded paper Reverend Miller had given him. He held it up. "This," he said, his voice ringing with authority across the yard, "is a marriage license filed this week in Cedar Flats. Sheriff, I believe you'll find that a man's wife cannot be held to another man's indenture contract." "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his eyes finding Alara's again, a world of meaning passing between them as he spoke her new name, "belongs here. With me." A stunned silence fell over the yard. Biddle's jaw dropped. Thorne's face, which had been a mask of triumph, contorted into a snarl of disbelief and fury. He snatched the paper from Silas's hand and scanned it, his eyes wild. He saw the preacher's signature, the official seal. It was real. He was defeated, not by force, but by a simple, unassailable piece of paper, and by a commitment he could not comprehend. "You tricked me," he sputtered, his voice choked with rage. "No, Thorne," Silas said, his voice like ice. "I protected what is mine. Now get off my land. And if you or your men ever come near my property or my wife again, I will not be talking to a sheriff. I'll be talking to you directly." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with a finality that left no room for doubt. Thorne crumpled the license in his fist, his face a mask of impotent fury. He threw it to the ground, spat one last time in the dust, and wrenched his horse's head around. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he snarled over his shoulder. But they all knew it was. He galloped away, his men scrambling to follow, leaving only the dust and the quiet in their wake. Sheriff Biddle sat on his horse, looking from the discarded paper on the ground to Silas and Alara, who were still holding hands. He looked deeply uncomfortable, a man caught on the losing side of a moral certainty. He cleared his throat. "Well, Silas, Mrs. Blackwood," he amended, tipping his hat awkwardly. "Seems the matter is resolved. My apologies for the intrusion." He turned his horse and trotted away, eager to be gone. The dust settled. The sound of the retreating hoofbeats faded into the vast mountain silence. They were alone. The axe lay forgotten by the wood pile. The laundry flapped gently on the line. The world, which had been poised on the brink of disaster, slowly righted itself. Alara was still staring at Silas, her eyes luminous, her mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what had just happened. Mrs. Blackwood. He had called her his wife. He had declared her everything to him. He hadn't bought her. He hadn't saved her. He had chosen her. Silas bent down and picked up the crumpled marriage license. He smoothed it out as best he could, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He folded it carefully and held it out to her. "I'm sorry I didn't ask," he said, his voice quiet and raw. "I was afraid. Not of Thorn. Of you saying no. It's just a paper, Alara. We don't have to if you don't want to." She looked at the paper in his hand, then up at his face, at the raw vulnerability in his eyes. He, this strong, silent man of the mountains, had been afraid of her rejection. She reached out, and her fingers brushed his as she took the paper. She didn't look at it. Her gaze was fixed on him. You said I was everything to you," she whispered, the words still tasting of miracle. "I did," he confirmed, his heart in his throat. "And I meant it." A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, a true smile that reached her eyes and transformed her, chasing away the last shadows of the girl on the auction block. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "And it's not just a paper, Silas," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's a promise." He searched her eyes, seeing not gratitude or relief, but a reflection of his own feelings, a deep, quiet, and abiding love. He had sworn she was everything to him, and in her shining eyes, he saw the unspoken vow that he was everything to her, too. The sun was beginning to dip behind the western peaks, bathing the small ranch in a soft, golden light. He reached out and gently brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek that had been there since the fire. His hand lingered on her skin. Their past was a story of a transaction, of survival, of a dollar paid in dust. But their future, he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, would be a story of a home. He looked at the cabin, then back at her, his wife. He had found his heart in the last place he ever thought to look for it. He is her shield, and she is his harbor. He looks at the blue ribbon in her hair, a splash of impossible color in this hard country, and knows it is the banner of his victory. She looks at his calloused hand, now resting over hers, and knows it is the anchor of her world. They stand together in the fading light, two solitary souls who, against all odds, have created a universe on a small patch of mountain land. The thread is gone. The world has been held at bay, and what remains is the quiet, unbreakable truth of their connection. He has not just given her his name. He has given her back to herself, and in doing so, has found the missing part of his own soul. He sees her shiver, a slight tremble in the cooling air, and his hand tightens on hers. "Let's go inside," he says, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. She nods, a smile touching her lips, and together they turn and walk towards the warm, waiting light of the cabin, leaving the ghosts of the past to be scattered by the mountain wind. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.